Most Americans hear Israel and think war, rockets, far away. But what if I told you the battle playing out in the Holy Land isn't just about borders or ancient grudges? It's about us.
Senior counsel for Article 3.
Josh Hammer, you might know him.
Josh Hammer.
Josh Hammer, welcome back.
Josh Hammer.
I think that Israel and Civilization is the book really for this moment.
We are the champion and vindicator.
I frankly think, Rita, it's only going to get better from here. Who is to blame for this? Who is the moral actor to yield this result? When you forsake the Jewish people, very, very bad things have happened. I think that October 7th did indeed evince a civilizational inflection point.
In these next 4 years, every single day is going to matter.
What really changed my mind for all this is the antisemitism I've seen on campuses. It pissed me off.
Let's be very, very careful who we're dealing with.
This is We the People, and this is Josh Hammer.
We the people. Why you quiet? It's time to stand up for the truth. How they coming for our kids, so who gon' stand up for the youth? Ay, and we know we win because Yeshua is the proof. Ay, we the people like Garcia, so that's no excuse.
There are headlines, and then there are hinges of history. Most Americans hear Israel and think war, rockets, far away. But what if I told you the battle playing out in the Holy Land isn't just about borders or ancient grudges? It's about us, about our faith, our families, and the very freedoms we still have the guts to defend. Because what Hamas did on October 7th wasn't just terrorism, it was evil, unapologetic and unmasked. And Israel, our closest ally in the Middle East, has become the front line of a much deeper war. A war between civilization and barbarism, between truth and propaganda, between a culture that cherishes life and one that celebrates death. And while our media equivocates and our universities light candles for terrorists, everyday Americans, people like you and me, are left wondering, what does this mean for my kids, my church, my country? My guest today argues we can't afford to sit this one out. Josh Hammer is one of the clearest conservative voices in America, and his new book, Israel and Civilization, lays it out plainly. Israel isn't just fighting for survival, it's fighting for the soul of the West. If we lose our moral compass here, we lose it everywhere. And if we can't call evil by its name over there, we won't recognize it when it shows up on our doorstep. This isn't a foreign war. It's a civilizational one. And it's time we talked about it like it matters, because it does. This is We the People, and this is Josh Hammer. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Gates, what a wonderful introduction. You clearly get this issue, and I look forward to our conversation. Thanks for having me.
Well, what I want to do here is I want to take a very complex issue that's in the news every day, and we see it from all different angles. I want to break this down in a way that mothers and fathers sitting at the kitchen table, worrying about their families, worrying about their country, can understand this in a way that's relatable to them, and that so they can take this conversation and have more of these conversations in their homes, at their churches, and their communities. So let's try to do it in that sense, because there's no one on an intellectual level like you when it comes to covering these issues. But let's speak to the everyday American today. So let's start there. So for the mom, the working mom in Missouri, the dad in Texas, why should they care about what's going on in Israel halfway across the globe?
Okay, sure. So there's a lot of ways to answer this question, of course. So you mentioned churches, civilization versus barbarism. So, Gates, in my book, Israel and Civilization, I define Western civilization as being largely coterminous, coextensive with the Bible. Now, I'm being a little oversimplistic here. We all know about Leo Strauss, the great 20th century University of Chicago political scientist. Talks a lot about Greece and Rome and reason. Fine. But the argument that I make in my book very forthrightly, and I think this argument will resonate with people of faith, but it also is just going to be historically resonant, I think, for a lot of people not of faith who are just reading history clearly. I think that our amazing country, the greatest country that's ever existed, the United States, was founded much more heavily on revelation. It was founded much more heavily, that is, on the Jerusalem end of the Jerusalem-Athens kind of formulation of Western civilization. And there's too many possible data points, Gates, to get into, but just to kind of rattle off just a few while they're top of my mind. Our national seal, at the time of the American founding, there were men like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin who actually wanted it to be Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. Look at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, one of our great national icons. I mean, it's not Aristotle's, Nicomachean Ethics, which is inscribed there on the Liberty Bell. It's literally the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. And in the book and in much of my commentary, I like to just remind my fellow Americans, I'm not trying to create the universe. I'm basically just trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and just trying to remind people that so much of what we take for granted in our day-to-day morality, our ethics, even our law. I'm also a lawyer, so very much our legal code, our constitutional structure, so much of this goes back to Scripture and the Bible. So with that very much in mind, and has to be at the forefront of our minds, I think that October 7th and the wake-up call that it represented did indeed evince a civilizational inflection point. It was one of these very clear, stark moments that, as you correctly say, demonstrated what civilization, which again I'm defining broadly as synonymous with the Bible and Scripture. You can call it the Judeo-Christian tradition. I personally am totally fine with that term. You can call that on the one hand, or barbarism, Islamism, and so forth on the other hand. So that is kind of the philosophical framing here, and that I think has tangible ramifications as well when it comes to people of faith, when it comes to control of the holy sites in Israel there, when it comes to just the notion that this sliver of land between the river and the sea, as the propagandists tell us, there are tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans of good faith who care correctly about the fate of that land and accessibility to the holy sites in that land. And as my friend Charlie Kirk has often said over the years, thank God that the Jews of Israel have control over the holy sites, because they allow access to everyone. Could you imagine if the radical Islamists had control there? It would be a very, very, very dangerous day. But there are all sorts of other reasons as well why I think that we have to truly care as Americans about this particular conflict. I'll kind of just give a couple. One is, I mean, you talk about kind of the mom and pop conversation over the dinner table. Let's talk about just basic economics and the price of goods. America has a vested interest in freedom of navigation on the world's most frequently traversed waterways like the Red Sea, for instance, where you've had these Muslim pirates, the Houthis of Yemen, this Iranian proxy that have held commercial ships hostage there in the Red Sea for large swaths of the past year and a half, almost 2 years now. Well, you've had a lot of commercial ships that were too terrified, and I don't really blame them, to try to traverse those Muslim pirate-addled waters, and instead decide to go all around the Horn of Africa, around South Africa. Gates, that ends up being reflected in the price that you get at Walmart, Target there when it comes to the increased transportation cost of the goods there. So we care about freedom of navigation on a lot of these waterways as well. But another crucial point here is just emphasizing the point of Islamism. Islamism is one of the great civilizational threats we face. In the book, I define three. I call it wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism. The latter is a little tougher to pin down, but think about John Lennon's infamous song Imagine, probably the single worst song ever written, and you kind of get the idea. We're talking here about the World Economic Forum, this homogenizing imperative to try to stamp out all the various things that make us human in the first place: religion, God, nation, and so forth, family. But focusing just on Islamism for a second, look, I mean, I kind of came of political age on 9/11. I grew up in the New York City suburbs. I saw the smoke from the Twin Towers with my own eyes. So I don't really need to be reminded of Islamism. Tragically, people were reminded just this New Year's Day on Bourbon Street in Louisiana of just the latest Islamist massacre here. But everywhere you look, Islamism and Sharia supremacism are trying to essentially take over Europe. They are broadly succeeding there. And they're already starting to make inroads, believe it or not, here in the United States. Certainly, Joe Biden's porous border has allowed God knows how many Islamist sympathizing thugs to get over there. Anyone who's ever seen videos of Dearborn, Michigan knows exactly what I'm talking about there. So Israel is not just the spiritual front line, is not just the literal Holy Land and the anchor of the very biblical tradition that I'm arguing is the spine and the backbone of the West. In many ways, it is absolutely the tip of the spear of the West pushing back against radical Islamism as well. And, back in the day, Gates, a lot of the older kind of neoconservatives like to say, let's fight the bad guys there so we don't fight them here. That's true with a caveat. The caveat is that America, if we're a good ally to Israel, we don't really have to fight the bad guys ourselves. All we have to do is just give our ally support and say, You guys do that. Like, go do your thing. I mean, go hog wild when it comes to Hamas, Hezbollah, which are literally U.S.-recognized foreign terrorist organizations there. Iran, a regime that is not just at war with Israel, whether Americans want to admit it or not, they've been at war with us since the revolution in 1979 as well. So Israel's friends are our friends, their enemies are our enemies there. So it really is kind of the canary in the coal mine for all these various things we're talking about.
Yeah, so you actually say in your book, and you just quoted it there, Israel is the West's man on the spot, the tip of the spear in the battle against Islamist terrorism and secular nihilism alike. You know, I've always been a conservative. I used to call myself a social conservative, and then 8 years ago I converted to Catholicism, and I said, I'm not a social conservative, I'm a moral conservative. These are no longer social issues, these are moral issues, and I think by aligning ourselves with Israel and supporting them, you know, we protect our own Judeo-Christian heritage, our freedom to worship, our protection against innocence. So I like the way that you sort of framed all of that. I've learned so many terms. I mean, these are terms I knew, but so many terms are getting redefined nowadays, whether you're an isolationist or a protectionist or a neoconservative or a hawkish isolate. There's so many terms out there. How about just being a moralist? And when our morals are being invaded anywhere in the world, we have a moral obligation to help support those. It's you know, it is a foreign policy issue, but foreign policy is sort of defined by, you know, geography. It's an American issue because these are our values being attacked around the world. I want to pivot a little bit because this audience is a very pro-life audience, and you debated brilliantly Dave Smith on stage at the Turning Point Student Action Summit just last week in Tampa. And he made a comment in that struck me, it offended me. He essentially said, if you support Israel, you cannot call yourself pro-life. I didn't like that. I'm as emphatically pro-life as any person you'll ever meet, and I support Israel. So I'd like you to sort of, not necessarily re-debate him, but sort of break down that sort of part of your debate with him.
Well, you know, first of all, Gates, so let me just kind of take what you previously said, and then I'll get to that quickly, Dave, because I think it's worth kind of just touching on one thing. So, look, I think the right is having a debate over foreign policy that in many ways is healthy. So I actually mostly am a fairly transactional realist when it comes to foreign policy. President Trump definitely is. And just to give one example as to what that looks like in practice, I support strong U.S.-Saudi ties, simply for fact that Saudi Arabia is a useful ally, or quasi, whatever you want to call it. They are a useful country for deterring Iranian hegemony, and Iran and its proxies are America's true enemies in the region there. You know, when it comes to values, the United States and Saudi Arabia have nothing in common whatsoever, like literally nothing whatsoever. So I don't view foreign policy strictly through a moralistic, values-based lens. Having said that, with that very large and important caveat aside, there are certain countries for whom there is a hard-headed, realist, strategic, called America First case to be an ally with, and then there's also an overarching moral imperative, and those we might call our truest allies in the world. We're talking here about Israel, the United Kingdom, Australia, and so forth there. So that's kind of just my view of foreign policy more generally. But sorry to get sidetracked there, but look, let's go back to the debate. Okay, so Dave Smith does say this line, as you say, and it was really kind of a jaw drop to the floor moment, for me at least, sitting on that debate stage. Like you, I am as pro-life as they come. I actually single-handedly resuscitated from the dead the University of Chicago Law Students for Life chapter when I was in law school. I marched in sub-zero temperatures in frigid Chicago for life. I have spoken at Lila Rose's live action summits numerous times. I'm all in on this issue. I have been all in for a very, very long time. In fact, I've sometimes thought of it as one of the 1, 2, 3 most important issues. I still do, actually, that I care about. So when Dave Smith did say that you can't be pro-life while defending Israel, I mean, on the one hand, it's the logic of a kindergartner. I mean, it's just so utterly dumb, for lack of a better explanation, that, like, on the one hand, you kind of almost don't want to dignify it with a proper response there. But, you know, look, I mean, we did kind of, I did reaffirm, not that I have to reaffirm, I'm an observant Jew, for God's sake, but, I mean, we did reaffirm that I believe, of course, in Genesis 1:27, that we're all made in God's image, which we all do, and all that. And that was a really important part of that particular conversation then on that stage. But, you know, the more important and interesting part of this debate is, who's responsible for the casualties in Gaza? I mean, if you want to call yourself pro-life, and again, I am too. I care about the maiming, the harm, the death of every innocent human being. There's actually a somewhat interesting debate, not to derail us, as to what exactly a civilian is, which is actually a more complicated question than it may appear in places like Gaza. But let's cabin that aside. Let's just stipulate, for the sake of argument, as lawyers do, that there are indeed innocent civilians who have been killed tragically over the course of the Israel-Gaza war. There, the relevant question that someone who calls himself or thinks himself as pro-life would ask is, who is to blame for this? Who is the moral actor who has acted immorally to yield this result? And it is my contention that Hamas is single-handedly responsible. I would actually argue for every single casualty that has happened in Gaza since the war started, because, again, they unambiguously started this war. I have been there, to the kibbutzim, to the villages that were slaughtered in Nazi, the forests of Poland-esque fashion. I mean, unspeakable stuff. I mean, they knew exactly what was going to happen there, and every single casualty, I would argue, is attributable to them. Certainly, you can kind of compound that with the notion that as we discussed on that stage, and Charlie did a good job of kind of driving home this point as the moderator, that we know without question is undeniable that Hamas has a well-orchestrated, well-established system of using human shields. They literally launch their rockets. They have their command centers from mosques and schools and United Nations facilities and all of that there. And the thing that I would have liked to do a little more on that stage, I didn't really have time, is to explain the measures that Israel goes to try to prevent civilian casualties, like dropping leaflets from planes and literally calling out of apartments and phone numbers there. They go above and beyond there. And of course, we also know from John Spencer, who's the head of urban warfare studies at West Point, who's quite literally the world's leading expert on urban warfare, the civilian to combatant death ratio in Gaza since the war started is actually 1.5 to 1, which is the most humane ratio that he's, according to him, the head of the West Point Urban Warfare Studies Department, that's the most humane ratio in the entire history of urban warfare. It's actually even better than the U.S. Army did in Fallujah during the ISIS counterinsurgency in 2016-2017 there. So, but look, I mean, I kind of get back to the optics of the debate there. It was very much a self-own for Dave Smith to say that, Gates, because I believe you were there. The crowd vociferously booed. The crowd booed vocally. It was one of two times that Dave Smith was booed. I don't think I was booed a single time during that debate. It was a massive, massive own goal, you might say there. He seemed to very quickly retreat from that, and then to try to very sloppily and hastily kind of rephrase the point that he was making. No one was buying that because it wasn't even convincing there. But it was just a low IQ talking point there, and no one who is truly earnestly pro-life really ought to buy it.
Hey guys, it's Gates. Thanks for tuning in. I'm asking you to like, share, and subscribe to the show. I hear that all the time when I watch and listen to podcasts. And now that I have a show, I know the difference that it makes. It really does boost us in the algorithm. And the better we do in the algorithm, the better guests we're going to get, the better content we're going to be able to produce. This show is not mine. It's yours. So in a way, you're helping yourself. So please like, share, and subscribe, and God bless. So we can fight wars and conflicts around the world with military, with government action, but I want to talk about the church, the American church, both Christian and Jews. What is the church's responsibility here, and has the church been bold enough in this situation?
When it comes to the Israel-Hamas conflict?
Correct, yeah.
Look, Gates, I feel very strongly. I'm an observant Jew. My best friend from childhood was a religious Christian. I have been passionate about Jewish-Christian relations for my entire life. To this day, many of my best friends in the world are evangelical Protestants and traditional Catholics. I have been passionate about this literally forever. Anyone who reads my book, Israel and Civilization, you will see how passionate I am about this. It's very much one of the themes that weaves its way throughout the book. It is my contention, I mean, and from my vantage point, I wish that American Christians were 100% pro-Israel. I mean, to me, it seems pretty obvious. Obviously, that is not necessarily the case. For what it's worth, Gates, I mean, just to be charitable here, I mean, American Jews are not 100% pro-Israel. There are any number of rabidly left-wing and at times grossly self-hating Jews. In fact, I debated one on that Turning Point USA stage, Dave Smith. So, I mean, it's not like Jews are unanimously, overwhelmingly pro-Israel too. Certainly the overwhelming majority of observant Jews who know Judaism, know Torah, do Judaism, do Torah, they are almost unanimously, probably like 95+%, going to be overwhelmingly pro-Israel there. And, a similar-ish trend certainly happens, I think, within the American church, where, the more religious the evangelical Protestant or the traditional Catholic are going to get, you're typically going to see a very strong positive correlation to not just pro-Israel, but oftentimes kind of philo-Semitic, pro-Old Testament, and so forth sentiment there as well. But, the church is ultimately somewhat decentralized, right? And I think a lot of it does fall on certain leaders. I would love to see more powerful leaders come out even more overwhelmingly outspoken about, the moral duty to support what a famous pope once said as our elder brothers in faith. I can't remember if that was John Paul II or a different pope. There was a beautiful, beautiful kind of formulation here. This notion of the original people of the book and the great Gentile offshoot. I love this sort of imagery there. So, look, I wish every single Christian, I wish every single Jew for that matter, were overwhelmingly pro-Israel, but I've certainly been happy with the American Christian support for Israel. Now, having said that, and here's where it gets a little dicier. There definitely is a pocket of provocateurs on both the Jewish and the Christian side, on kind of the very far left Jewish side, and I guess we can call it the quote-unquote very far right Christian side, who are, I think, trying to drive a wedge between not just the U.S. and Israel, but indeed between Judaism and Christianity there. You do see this play out. There are some folks who I think are trying to bring back certain strands of Christian theological thinking that traditionally have been somewhat anathema in the American way of thinking about Christian theology. Certainly, the theology of the American founding was a very, very pro-Old Testament, pro-Hebrew Bible way of thinking there. I think you're seeing some people try to rehabilitate kind of older and forgotten strands of thinking that would not have particularly pleasant ideas for the Jewish people and the Jewish state there. So I'm very much aware of that, and I'm on guard for that. I hope those efforts fail. My personal ability to affect that change is somewhat limited as a Jew, but it's definitely something that I talk with my Christian friends about, that's for sure.
A Jew enlightening a Catholic on Pope quotes is a highlight, so I appreciate that. This is a good segue to where I want to go to next. Before all this happened, I didn't really think about this whole relationship with Israel, even my friendships with Jews. I didn't really think about them the way that I think about them now. And what really changed, obviously, October 7th, but what really changed my mind for all this is the anti-Semitism I've seen on campuses. They had the opposite effect on me. They pissed me off. They drew me closer to the Jewish side than I've ever been. Not that I was ever not with it, but it endeared me to you all. And I said, this is wrong, this is evil, this is so ignorant. I just couldn't stand it. But I want to get your take on the growing anti-Semitism in America, mostly on college campuses. We're also seeing it on social media. What sort of spiritual or moral vacuum is allowing to fester in our country? How did we get to a place where American universities have become a rallying cry for terrorists? What does that say about our institutions?
So I've actually faced this twice personally, post-October 7th. So about a month after the 7th of October, it was mid-November 2023, I was giving a talk through YAF, Young America's Foundation, at the University of Michigan on the war. That was my first encounter. We had probably, 25, 30, maybe 35 protesters there. They had their hands painted red as if to indicate genocide. By the way, at that point, the IDF tanks had started rolling into Gaza, like literally 2 weeks prior. The single largest and most horrific genocide against Jewish people since Hitler had just been perpetrated. So, that itself says a lot, right, about the timing there. It kind of reminds me of Zoran Mamdani. The kind of folks who were accusing Israel of genocide literally before the tanks even started rolling in. Like on a serious level, what the actual hell is wrong with you? But anyway, so I'm there in Michigan. About 5 minutes into my talk, they all stand up and they hold these signs. I actually don't even remember what the signs said. I think they were allegedly photos of children who have died in Gaza, I guess over the course of the last 20 years, because it wouldn't have even made sense in that particular post-October 7th moment there. Then a few minutes later, they start coughing, it kind of sounds like a tuberculosis ward at a hospital at that point there. Then they turn their backs on me, and then they start kind of doing the whole from the river to the sea chanting there. And the Michigan security there did absolutely nothing. This went on for 35, 40 minutes. I actually considered filing a First Amendment lawsuit. This is a public university. They're bound by the First Amendment. Long story short, they basically shut up of their own accord. They get out after banging on the walls. They're red from their hands, or like on the walls of this very beautiful room there. I mean, these are barbaric, savage, young people there. I finish my talks, and a police person escorts me out. Then a very similar thing happened actually this past October at Loyola University Chicago Law School. This is actually even more egregious, if anything, because I was there for a Federal Society debate, a legal debate on a completely unrelated topic. We were literally debating Trump's lawfare and presidential immunity at the United States Supreme Court, but nonetheless, because I am Jewish and I am an outspoken Zionist, we had some malcontent protesters. They decided to get up and kind of leave, and they took their jolly time during a very tightly timed debate. It kind of felt like a heckler's veto. I made a snarky comment, as one does in a very tense situation as this, and I said, I hope you will all silence your pagers on your way out the door, which is obviously a reference to the Hezbollah beeper operation. Long story short, my interlocutor, who was supposed to debate me, kind of yelled at me and said, you've offended the Jesuit values of this university there, and ended the debate. I ended up needing a double police escort to evacuate me to a squad car out of there. My event the next day was canceled in retribution, seemingly, for what had just happened. It was a total mess. So I've seen this in person multiple times. What it says about American University is obviously nothing good, but this is nothing new either. I mean, this goes back decades. I mean, look, you and I have done Claremont fellowships. We're very much part of this thing called the conservative movement. Well, the guy who is sometimes credited as one of the founders of the conservative movement, William F. Buckley Jr., his very first book was on this topic, God and Man at Yale. He wrote this in 1951, if I have the exact year correct here. That's a very long time ago. I mean, that is almost 75 years ago. I mean, almost to the year, right? I mean, so this has been happening in the universities for a very, very long time. The rise of the 1960s, cultural Marxists, the Frankfurt School, Christopher Rufo had a fantastic book on this roughly 2 years ago. So these trends have been happening a long time. I think what's happened post-October 7th is that the keffiyeh-clad, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas radicals have essentially replaced the Black Lives Matter radicals of 2020 as kind of the left's new cause. And I think part of this is kind of just understanding the mentality and the psychology of how the modern American left operates. I think back actually often to this essay in The Atlantic back when I was in law school, maybe 11, 12 years ago or so. And I was talking then about the same-sex marriage fight, but this is prior to the Supreme Court erroneously ruling that it was constitutionalized. And at that time, there was this article in The Atlantic basically saying that this is our great civil rights imperative, the same way that back in the 1960s in Selma, Alabama, Rosa Parks, MLK, all that, this is our fight now. And that's obviously absurd, but hold that aside. The point is that the left, and being on the left, especially when you kind of remove God and Bible and Scripture out of the picture, that urge to kind of feel something doesn't go anywhere. Like that urge is intrinsic to the human condition. It is best and most properly channeled when it comes to the deity, the creator, house of worship, family, all the things that Americans once totally agreed upon. But for the left, they're ever chasing this new moral vanguard cause, no matter how immoral that purported moral cause may or may not be. So that was the Women's March in 2017. It was Black Lives Matter and George Floyd back in 2020. And now apparently it's Hamas, which is egregious. It's utterly disgusting. But this is how they operate. And, look, if I had to guess, I'm sure there will be some new cause 2 to 3 years from now. That's not to say that the Jew hatred is going to go away. We've been with Jew hatred at least ever since Pharaoh oppressed the Israelites in the book of Exodus. So it's been with us for a very, very, very long time. And I think Jews probably have to, basically accept that this is just part of God's plan for the world. I mean, that's not to say that we shouldn't push back and confront it, but it kind of just, to an extent, is what it is, to be honest with you, right? So, I think the left, having said, they'll probably move on from this to some other cause in the next few years, if I had to guess.
So going back to your book, Israel and Civilization, you use a term, inflection point. It's a term I love because I think inflection points happen in our own lives and culture all the time, and we tend to miss them sometimes when they happen. And it's important to not just recognize them, but to point them out to others when they occur, which you did. And your quote says, "We are standing at a civilizational inflection point, and we must push back against Islamism, wokeism, and global neoliberalism." So, Josh, what does this inflection point look like on Main Street, and what risks are we ignoring if we sit on the sidelines?
So one of the things, Gates, that I do in this book, which you've so kindly pledged numerous times now, so thank you, is I try to illustrate to the proverbial or literal Main Street American, folk, my fellow American, just how much of our day-to-day lives are actually directly taken, essentially, from the Hebrew Bible. And there's many, many examples, accounts. I'll kind of just name a couple, right? So, this notion of the golden rule, do unto others as we like to be treated. I mean, I went to public school K through 12. I only became religious in recent years, but when I was in public school kindergarten, I was taught the golden rule, obviously not with any kind of religious valence because this was a public school. But if you think about it, this notion of the golden rule, which is one of the glues that hold society together. I mean, it's one of the great cohesives in a society, is that we are expected to treat others with some degree of kindness, because that's how we want to be treated as well. That's just from Leviticus. I mean, that is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, the imperative to treat the stranger as your own fellow. So that is just one kind of daily Levitical, Hebrew Bible norm that kind of holds society together today. We already touched on Genesis 1:27, the divine image imperative, this notion that God created man, he made man in his own image, male and female, he created them. To me, Genesis 1:27 is the single foundational ethical and moral imperative for all of Western civilization. So much of American history never, ever, ever, I would argue, would have happened were it not for Genesis 1:27. Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence there, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal there. Extremely difficult to think that he would have written those words, or John Locke would have written those words a century prior in England, were they not living in an overarching Christian civilization that understood the divine image imperative. In Hebrew, we would say B'Tselem Elohim, obviously in Latin, Imago Dei. It beggars belief that Locke and Jefferson would have written these words absent that overarching context. So you get the Declaration, you get the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, the Great Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War. You get Martin Luther King's speech in Washington, D.C., the Civil Rights Act of 1964. None of this, I argue, none of it would have happened were it not for Genesis 1:27. And by the way, just kind of a brief comment as well. Even on constitutional structure. So I've mentioned a couple of times that I'm a lawyer. I followed the Trump prosecutions very closely over the past 2.5 years, whatever it's been now. Our friends on the left used to shout over and over again how no one is above the law in the context of these various silly prosecutions against Donald Trump. And okay, I actually agree with that there. I have a difference of opinion as to what the law is. They've kind of forgotten about the vesting clause of Article 2, but neither here nor there. The point, Gates, excuse me, for present purposes, the point is as follows, which is this notion that no one is above the law. Where does that come from? Well, I can tell you exactly where it came from, actually. It comes from an old conservative English common lawyer by the name of John Fortescue, who codified this principle into the English common law in the late 14th century, early 15th century, where he famously said that as part of the English common law, that the king of England, is not above the law. Where was he citing, like literally citing for the proposition? The book of Deuteronomy, because that's actually where that notion comes from, that the king is not above the law. So much of this is just directly downstream from the Hebrew Bible there. And, that really is one of the great goals of my book, Israel and Civilization. The book covers a lot of topics. It covers foreign policy. There's a lot in there. It really is kind of sweeping there. But in many ways, those earlier chapters are really just trying to kind of just remind Americans where so much of our day-to-day values and lives come from. And really, ultimately, Gates, I mean, without Bible, without Scripture, we're nothing. I mean, if we are willing to just kind of forsake this and let something else fill in the void, whether that something else is Hamas or the paganism of an Andrew Tate or a Bronze Age pervert, we're not going to be in a good place there. I mean, I just saw Andrew Tate actually, yelling on social media about how no man should ever get married. Could you imagine? I mean, could you imagine a society that has forsaken kind of the godly and biblical notion of marriage and family for kind of exalting this notion of a man just spreading his seed as far as the eye can go? I mean, what a disgusting worldview. And, the stakes are pretty high, but it really does start with reclaiming the Bible and Scripture. And in the book, I argue that requires a special place in our hearts, our minds, and indeed our geopolitical strategy for not just the children of Israel, the Jewish people, but very much also the capital S state of Israel, which is our canary in the coal mine on all these various fronts.
We don't have enough time to talk about Andrew Tate on this episode because if I get fired up, it'll cannibalize all the wonderful information that you're dropping on us today. So I won't do that. So if that is an inflection point, oftentimes through and after an inflection point, there's sort of a realignment. Not always, but do you think or do you believe that this war is forcing a cultural realignment for Western civilization? Josh, when if we're sitting here 10 or 20 years from now and this war is behind us, has there been a realignment?
That's a really, really good question. I don't know. I'm going to be honest with you. I do not know the answer. The left is just so far gone, Gates, that it's very, very difficult for me to see that particular half of the American political spectrum getting their moorings and their bearings together. I mean, this is a political party, the Democratic Party, that has nominating people like Zoran Mamdani in New York City, this guy in Minneapolis, Omar Fateh, whatever his name is there. I mean, on this very specific issue, the issue of Israel, I saw a recent poll. My buddy Harry Enton at CNN was doing a recent polling analysis, and he showed that as of now, Democrats support the Palestinian Arabs over Israel by like a 41% margin. I mean, that's like a 50-plus point swing in the past 6 years. I mean, that's astonishing stuff. So, if America is to be saved, it is not going to come from the left. It's basically what I'm trying to say there. There's no way that Zoran Mamdani is going to recover the grand American experience. So it obviously has to come from the right, and I'm of the right, you are of the right. I think about this question on a daily basis. I mean, these are my foremost missions in life, right? Is to make the right formidable, is so that the right can ultimately try to save the American experiments, to fight for the Jewish people, my people. I mean, these are very much the goals that animate me on a day in, day out basis. So, I'm not going to confidently say that I know that we're going to be okay, 10 years from now, because ultimately you never know whether you will be okay. The notion, once peddled by Barack Obama and others, this kind of Whig theory of history that the moral arc of the universe is long and it always bends in a certain direction. That's just not how it goes. History is very much kind of like a jagged kind of stock market, returns. It kind of goes up and down and down and up there. That's just the way it's been. So I don't know, but I'm very, very, very happy, certainly, with where the Trump administration is in particular. I am deeply, deeply happy about that. I am really, really happy as well when I look at so many young, eloquent, young conservatives that I interact with on virtually all these campus trips that I go on there. I've been overwhelmingly pleased with the positive feedback to my book, to my Turning Point USA debate against Dave Smith there. There are definitely some troubling signs. I mean, I'll just kind of name a name and be blunt. I am very troubled by people like Tucker Carlson. I'm very troubled by a lot of what he's saying there. I say that, by the way, as a former massive fan of his. I was on his Fox News show. We've had very pleasant personal interactions, so it brings me no pleasure to call him out like that. But he is representative of this rising strand, really not merely of just anti-Israel sentiment, but kind of this notion that what it means to be America first seemingly is actually, paradoxically, to be kind of anti-America and to actually be pro our geopolitical enemy. So a lot of these things really do trouble me. And these are live debates happening in real time on the American right, and it's really fun, frankly, to do my small part, to be a part of these debates. The stakes are extremely high. Ultimately, though, if I can kind of give you a yes or no answer, I said that I wouldn't make a prediction, but I do tend to be an optimist. I'm born on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, as a good Claremonster, right? I'm born on Lincoln's birthday, and Lincoln is my favorite figure in American history. There. Yeah, he's literally my favorite figure in American history. By the way, no American president quoted the Hebrew Bible in his speeches like Abraham Lincoln, by the way. He quoted it all the freaking time. So talk about kind of a biblically literate statesman, but anyway, Lincoln is many things. He's also kind of the consummate optimist, right, in American history there. So, I kind of fall back on my kind of, Lincoln crutch, and I'll kind of give you the answer that I think you want, which is that I think we're going to be okay. But, like any conservative, you should always have fallback plans as well.
As a Claremont fellow, Lincoln fellow, you're tooting my horn. I love Lincoln. So two final questions. One for my audience, and then I'm going to ask you more of a self-serving one about you and your book. If you could leave my listeners with one conviction about why standing for truth in this moment matters, what would it be?
Well, I think that there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but we kind of already alluded to this, but one very easy way to, I think, answer this question would be look at the alternative. If you look at what the alternatives to God and Bible and Scripture, to Genesis 1:27, Leviticus 19:18, look at what the alternative is. The alternative is rotten. It is abysmal. It is abhorrent, and frankly, in many ways, it is utterly horrifying. I mean, the entire notion of contemporary wokeism on the left, of so-called DEI, this notion of race, ethnic, gender, etc., religion-based hierarchies there, and how some are oppressors and some are oppressed based not on individual but class distinctions. All of this is only possible in the absence of Genesis 1:27. So, if you are instinctually appalled by the DEI woke agenda, which you should be because it's pretty freaking appalling, then that ought to lead you to double down on the value system that was in place and really for a very long time helped prevent this garbage. And if it's kind of made great again, I think could prevent it anew. And that really kind of is the biblical system there. And that's not just true for wokeism. It's obviously true for Islamism and Sharia supremacism. Anyone who's seen what that looks like, it's really, really, really awful, frankly, there. And, thank God in America there are not too many examples of this. Again, maybe Dearborn, Hamtramck, Michigan are exceptions, but anyone who's read about what's happened to Europe under mass Islamic immigration over the past 25, 30 years, this horrific, primarily Pakistani child grooming scandal all throughout England that the Parliament just last year was trying to sweep under the rug yet again. And anyone who's read about the so-called no-go zones in places like Brussels, Belgium, and the suburbs of Paris, it's really, really quite terrifying there. And it's not just terrifying, by the way, for the Jews. The Jews are simply just the canary in the coal mine. But these same people who hate the Jews, it frankly goes without saying, they obviously hate the Christians too. They obviously hate all of the so-called infidels. There have been any number. Look at what's happening in Syria right now, and these tragic massacres there. They're coming after Catholics and Greek Orthodox Jews, all the various infidels that don't meet their idiosyncratic conception of Sharia supremacism or Islamism. So it's really, 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 frankly, horrifying stuff. And the best way to prevent the further ascent of any of these toxic ideologies, whether it's global neoliberalism, wokeism, and Islamism, is to double down on that which made us great, and I truly, earnestly feel could, and yes, I will say, will make us great again, and that is the Bible.
So my final question for you, I'm going to answer it first. You're on an intellectual level with these issues that's unrivaled. You're as well researched as anybody on these issues. You're a Jew living through these issues, but you have a way through, obviously on this episode, through your spoken word, but through your writing, to really bring common sense to very complex issues. I found your book, Israel and Civilization, to be very approachable, even while the issue is so grave and complex. But if you could give my viewers and listeners one reason why the everyday American, if they were going to read one book on this issue, why it should be yours.
Well, that's really kind of you, first of all, so thank you very much for those kind words. And I did that deliberately, by the way. I actually really did try to write this book, Israel and Civilization, in a very approachable way, for the proverbial everyday American. Frankly, just to be kind of blunt here, what is the point of writing a book if you're going to, to purposely try to throw in all kind of complicated words and overly nuanced points just to reach kind of the, the eggheads in academia? There's really no point. You write a book because you want it to be read, right? So thank you for noticing that. That very much was a deliberate attempt that I made. This is my first book, and I wanted to do that there, and thankfully the reception has been overwhelmingly positive there. So I think that Israel and Civilization is the book really for this moment. It's the book for this moment in many ways. One, because, again, we are at an inflection point, as you correctly say, and that's very much how my book opens, and I take that prism head on. I explain what the inflection point is, what are the two sides, what are the stakes there. So it was really kind of written for this moment. But especially if you are on the right and you are following contemporary debates when it comes to who we are as conservatives, I have a lot to say on that issue. When it comes to what we should believe when it comes to foreign policy, I have an entire chapter 7, making the explicit, called a MAGA America First case for U.S.-Israel relations, where I excoriate not just the failed Wilsonian liberal interventionism of Barack Obama and all that. I also excoriate the Bush-era neoconservative foreign policy as well, because they're actually both very wrong in my view. And I explain why through this more kind of hard-headed America First case, U.S.-Israel relations don't merely make sense, they make, I would argue, the most sense, actually, of all these various paradigms there. So that is I think that's a very, very necessary and crucial argument for this particular moment. But above all, Gates, and I'll leave it with this, the number one reason why this book is important is because it's essentially a call for people to wake up and embrace Scripture again. That really is kind of the fundamental, probably the single most important parts of this book. It's a very multifaceted book, but I quote Bible again and again and again throughout this book. And I have a whole chapter that is calling on my fellow Jews to really be a light unto the nation and to lead by example by actually, learning Torah, doing Judaism, doing the mitzvot, the commandments there. But it is absolutely just as clear a call for my Christian friends and allies as well to do your religion too, to be proud, to double down on Scripture there, because without Scripture, this country never would have been founded, frankly, and without a scriptural foundation, I'm not entirely sure how much longer it can exist, or at least how much longer it can exist as a proverbial city on the hill, as the last shining beacon of mankind, as a wise man once said.
Josh, other than your book, where can people find your work, follow you, all that good stuff?
Sure. So I'm on X at Josh _Hammer. My Instagram is at Josh B Hammer. I write a weekly syndicated column. It goes up at Newsweek, Real Clear Politics, Los Angeles Times, Daily Signal, Daily Caller, and so forth. And then my show, The Josh Hammer Show, is also available everywhere podcasts are available.
Josh Hammer, you're a force for good and a force for truth in a complicated world. Thanks for joining us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
We the people. Why you quiet? It's time to stand up for the truth. And they coming for our kids, so who gon' stand up for the youth? Ay, and we know we win because Yeshua is the proof. Ay, we the people like Garcia, so that's no excuse.